2020, the issue of making sure that the European public is aware of the legal tools available to them has become more important than ever. There are also worries that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated racism and related intolerance, with an upsurge in othering and racist incidents against people of perceived Asian origin, Roma, and migrants. Now, Mindset is a collaborative project between Euractiv in Brussels and Romania and JEF Europe, and it's funded by the REC program. It's attempted to raise these concerns by focusing on the media and youth in Northern, Eastern, and Southern Europe. Mindset discusses how these different areas differ when it comes to discrimination and what needs to be done both on a national and European scale to support victims and entities supporting victims of discrimination. So to start out, to tell us more about Mindset, I'd like to introduce Josie Hane from Euractiv, who will give a short overview of the Mindset project. Josie?
Hi, Dave. Good morning, and thank you again for everyone for joining us today. My name is Josie Hane, and I am one of Euractiv's European project managers responsible for Mindset. And as Dave said, it's the EU-funded project that's linked to this event. Mindset stands for Moving the Ideas of Non-Discrimination, Supporting Inequality Transformation. It's a project that's funded by DG Justice through the REC program, and it aims to raise awareness on non-discrimination in Europe with a specific focus on the media and the youth. And in the belief that media can play a prominent role, for the last 20 months, with this month actually being the last month of the project, Euractiv has worked with our partners, which is Euractiv Romania, our partner in Romania, and also GEF Europe, Les Jeunes Européens Fédéralistes. And we have created communication, awareness raising, and capacity building activities to put a spotlight on discrimination based on ethnic origin in Brussels, Romania, Italy, and Sweden. To give an example, we've organized media trainings with a specific focus on giving journalists the tools to report correctly on non-discrimination in Europe. And also we've organized stakeholder workshops with a specific focus on equality bodies in these countries. This final form of the project will now also look into a relevant topic right now, which is how COVID has affected discrimination in Europe and also how to combat it. Thank you again for joining. And before passing the floor back to Dave, please enjoy our Mindset project video.
14% of citizens report having suffered racist violence. 50% of people experience discrimination when searching for work because of their ethnicity. The risk of poverty is almost double among people of immigrant origin than the rest of EU citizens. Only 14 out of the 27 member states have dedicated action plans to fight racism and ethnic discrimination. These are only a few examples of the forms of injustice that, in spite of the progress, still persist in the EU. According to the EU treaties, any form of discrimination based on any ground such as sex, sexual orientation, religion, belief, language, disability, political or any other opinion, as well as race, color, ethnic or social origin, shall be prohibited. There are currently 5 EU directives aimed at tackling different forms of discrimination, one of which is specifically targeting discrimination on the grounds of race and ethnic origin. However, the implementation varies quite a lot from country to country and could definitely be improved. By the way, even though there are equality bodies in all member states, only 1/3 of EU citizens are fully aware that they are legally protected against discrimination. In 2008, the European Commission went one step forward and tabled a proposal for a directive on implementing the principle of equal treatment in a horizontal way. However, as unanimity is required at the Council, the text has been blocked ever since. The recent Black Lives Matter demonstrations across Europe has put the issue back on the agenda. Euractiv and Euractiv Romania have joined forces with the Jeunes Européens Fédéralistes and the Migration Policy Group to raise awareness on persisting discriminatory practices across the EU, educate the public about the proper ways of addressing these issues, look at the existing legislation and its implementation in different member states, with a particular focus on Italy, Sweden and Romania, share the stories of the people suffering discrimination and amplifying the voices of experts in the field while working to improve media coverage, because the information is key for change.
So that's the context that we're having this discussion today, and indeed we're going to be talking specifically about how COVID has exacerbated these trends and whether or not it's actually moving things forward when it comes to anti-discrimination legislation and policy. We heard there how some of the efforts have been blocked by national governments and the Council, and also it's not all member states in the EU that even have any form of discrimination policy or redress at national level. So we're going to hear more about that from our panel of experts. Before I introduce them, let me let you guys know a couple housekeeping notes. First of all, you guys will be able to ask your questions to the panelists using the feature on the right-hand side of your screen. You can just put your questions in there starting now, and I will be reading out those questions to the panelists toward the end of the panel. You can also participate in the debate online on Twitter using the hashtag EADebates right there below me. So let me introduce our panelists now. We have Szabolcs Schmidt, Head of Unit for Non-Discrimination and Roma Coordination at the European Commission's Justice Department. We have French MEP Pierre Karlskind from the Renew Europe Group. We have Swedish Green MEP Alice Kuhnke. We have Jose Antonio Moreno Diaz, a lawyer, a legal advisor on immigration, asylum, and integration issues at the European Economic and Social Committee. We have Ilke Adam, political science professor at the Brussels School of Governance and co-director of the Brussels Interdisciplinary Research Center on Migration and Minorities at VUB. And finally, we have Juliana Santos Valgren, Senior Advocacy Officer and Acting Director at the European Network Against Racism. Thank you all so much for being with us today to talk about this very important topic. Mr. Schmidt, let's start with you. So tell us a little bit about what the European Commission is doing to combat discrimination.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning to everyone. Well, the Commission is working mainly on three avenues in order to combat discrimination and to protect the core value of equality. First, as guardian of the treaty, we are the ones who make sure that the member states of the European Union have properly applied the legislation, which all has been nicely presented in the run-up video, and that it's also applied in practice, not only transposed into the national legislation, but also applied. The Commission is also carefully looking how this application takes place, and of course there was also a reference to a gap in the legislation. We have proposed a legislative act to fill this act, but not only that. The Commission is also not satisfied with the diversity, how the existing legislation in the field of racial and ethnic origin, but also other grounds, is applied throughout the European Union. And that's why we have also decided to come up with a new legislative proposal in the field of equality in the course of the next year. This has just been announced in the new work program. So that is the legislative field. The other area where we are active is to monitor the actual equality situation in the European Union. It is unfortunately such that we do not have regular statistical information from the member states on the equality situation, and that's why the European Commission is doing regularly the so-called Eurobarometer surveys, which go to the broad public in order to better understand how discrimination is perceived by the citizens. And in addition, there are the surveys by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, which go to the individual minority groups to see their experiences of discrimination. And it's extremely interesting, just to flag that we have a very broad public support. About 3/4 of the EU citizens are fully in favor of this core value. But when it comes into the experiences, then the picture is very sad and bad. And just to give you an example, the most discriminated groups are actually the Roma, you mentioned them, and less than half of the respondents would, for instance, feel comfortable with having a Roma person in highest elected position. This is really striking, and it's similarly bad for LGBTI trans people. Stemming from that, we come to the third avenue where we are working, and that is actually dedicated policies where we engage in a dialogue with member states in order to drive forward, even beyond the competences that are assigned to the European Union, the topic of equality. It was mentioned already, we have dedicated strategies. The most developed one is the one on Roma equality. Then we have also a more broader action plan on anti-racism, which is now in full swing. And we have also a new LGBTIQ equality strategy. There's also gender equality strategy, disability strategy, anti-Semitism strategy. So there are a number of strategies which are in place, and where we are working with the member states to have a positive dialogue to achieve a situation that each member state takes the appropriate steps. And just to give you one example out of many, we are currently in the process to develop guidelines for national anti-racism or LGBTIQ equality actions in the member states. This is in a nutshell, very briefly, but in the discussion, I'm very happy to go more in detail with the different avenues. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So that's what the European Commission is up to. Let's hear about what the European Parliament is up to. Pierre, if we could turn to you, just making sure you're there, Pierre.
Yeah, I'm there,
okay,
and
I
have my
good.
camera.
Pierre, I wanted to ask you about the current context we find ourselves in. So do you think that EU policies need to be updated or adjusted to adjust to things like the pandemic, like what we're experiencing right now?
Well, first I'd like to thank Euractiv for inviting me to this panel. As you might know, one of the main issue regarding the discrimination that I am fighting for inside the European Parliament is the LGBTI discrimination. So I will mainly focus on this aspect, and we will maybe we can draw some general conclusions from it. But honestly, I think that we should reverse the question. I think we have to adjust our anti-discrimination policy to COVID, but we also need to adjust our anti-COVID policies to reduce their negative impact on discrimination. In fact, COVID affected more strongly segments of the population already discriminated, and it increased the discrimination gap. A few examples from the LGBT people. In order to be sure that the message of the NGO is passed, we need freedom of assembly, for example, to organize prides. But COVID took this freedom away, with governments sometimes using COVID as an excuse to keep LGBTIQ people quiet in these prides. There are also a problem of a specific access to healthcare, because we know all over Europe that COVID heavily restrained access to healthcare. And one final example is, in some families, having a gay son or a lesbian girl is not well accepted. Confinement made family live together during days and days. Where to go if needed, for asking help in time of confinement or and of limitation of physical meetings was a real issue for some people. So we could summarize by saying that COVID completely shut down, well, not completely, shut down a part of the LGBTI movement. It cut his access to public space. It made them stay at home when the aspiration is, on the contrary, to come out, to be visible. And one other thing is that COVID completely erased anti-discrimination organization from public space and from the media sphere. The one and only topic of debate in the media during more than a year has been COVID. So sometimes I really have the impression that on many topics, not only discrimination, of course, we've lost at least 1 year, maybe 18 months. What should be done? We need, of course, to ensure a proportionality of restrictive measures. This is really important. We should give flexibility for people to choose their quarantine place. There are experiments on that that might be interesting. And we need to monitor closely the impact of emergency measures on human rights. And this is something that we will have to do because the crisis is not over, and we will have to make sure that the freedoms are restored properly in the European Union. And finally, maybe we have understood that as we couldn't meet together, and we have today this video conference, the use of the digital. How can we make sure that the digital could be a tool to make better know the institutions, the NGOs that are dealing with discrimination? All these things made us think about that, and I will be glad to hear the comment and question of the people attending the video conference.
Thanks, Pierre. Yeah, this question of whether the COVID emergency measures have increased discrimination is a really key one. It's something we'll come back to during the discussion. In fact, I see we've already received a question about it from the audience. Alice, let's go to you next. Do you think that the EU's anti-discrimination policy is keeping up with the times?
Thank you, Dave, for the question, and thank you for inviting me to these discussions. Well, my short answer is no. We need to do so much more. And I think that is an important fact to state when we discuss what to do and how the situation is, that we are not doing enough. And I think it also is important to underline the fact that the willingness is not total from all the governments and from all politicians within the EU, the 27 member states, that this is something that is important. Because sometimes I got the feeling that when we discuss discrimination and racism and anti-racism and how to combat discrimination, we discuss it as if this is something that we all are devoted to fight, but all are not in this fight, because there are people, there are politicians, there are governments that think and feels that the discrimination is acceptable. And this is the big problem. It's a huge problem. And one outcome of this acceptance that racism is accepted is that the Equal Treatment Directive that I am the rapporteur for has been blocked for 14 years. As said in the movie, the short movie we just saw. And this blockage of this directive is a clear evidence of that the discrimination and the fight against discrimination are not shared as an important issue by all. So yes, that's a quite a bit longer answer than the no. We are not doing enough. We need to do so much more. And of course, as Mr. Schmidt said, there have been so many strategies, and there are now in the new working program suggestions. We can see that legislation in some parts will be put on the table, but still there are so much more that we need to do. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, this question of the geographic divide on this issue between Europe's West, East, and South is something that we'll come back to during the discussion. Jose Antonio, let's go to you next. You can really speak to the legal aspects of this. How strong, legally speaking, are the EU's non-discrimination law and practices?
Good morning, Dave, and thank you very much to take the European Economic and Social Committee on board on this debate, and thank you, Euractiv, for arranging all the details and preparing this debate. Definitely, there is not strong enough the tools from the legal point of view that the European Union is developing against discrimination. As you all know, and almost a year ago, in September 2020, the Commission presented the Anti-Racism Action Plan, an Union of Equality, it was called. The European Economic and Social Committee welcomes the Anti-Racism Action Plan put forward by the European Commission and hopes it will help the EU and member states institutions to renew their efforts in combating racism and other forms of structural discrimination. The plan is relevant and timely. The unfolding of the COVID-19 epidemiological crisis has created new challenges with regard to inclusion and promotion of diversity. Already marginalized groups, such as migrants, have experienced major medical, social, and economic hardships. In times of crisis, discriminatory attitudes and actions tend to become more prevalent. Even prior to COVID-19 crisis, the situation of minorities and vulnerable groups in the European Union was deteriorating. Anti-migrant attitudes became more widespread, put forward by electorally driven leaders and parties instigating anti-Muslim, anti-African, and anti-Asian sentiments. Historical minorities, as Roma, increasingly became targets of racially motivated hatred. The Jewish population in Europe became less and less safe, bringing back painful memories of the vicious anti-Semitism that plagued the continent before World War II. Against this background, the plan aims to streamline legislative, policy, and budgetary actions. While the plan brings together all available instruments, at times it seems to lack ambition and historical depth. Its approach is too prudent, while the situation on the ground is deteriorating fast. The European Economic and Social Committee would like to emphasize that action to combat discrimination, racism, xenophobia, and other types of intolerance at European level, it's a clear responsibility enshrined in the founding documents of the European Union. It is not optional, and the division of responsibilities between EU and national authorities should not become the basis for complacency and inaction. A specific concern is how to convince all EU member states to participate in this effort and ensure the active cooperation of various bodies, institutions, and organizations at national level. Let's keep the debate afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Let's turn to Ilke Adam next. Ilke, what are the trends that we're seeing when it comes to European anti-discrimination policy? How is this evolving?
Okay, maybe I'll start with a disclaimer, because talking about trends is going with a rough brush through history, and also I'll mainly talk about ethno-racial discrimination, on which I have my expertise and which I also observe in my own family on a daily basis for long years. So we should not forget that we come from a history in which ethno-racial discrimination has been legally and explicitly institutionalized. We should only think, and many people do not know about, for example, the colonial clause in the European Convention of Human Rights, in which it is stated that there was no automatic application to the overseas dependencies, let's call it as they were called, the colonies. And so at that time, when the discussions were ongoing on the European Convention, Léopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of Senegal, and then parliamentarian in France and poet and writer, called it not the European Convention of Human Rights, but the European Convention of the Rights of the Europeans. So we introduced this hierarchy. These human rights were not for all. Then we had a whole period, of course, in the post-war period, and until, in fact, in many countries, until the 2000s, when the directives came on, that we didn't have any legislation. So it was just legally possible to discriminate in hiring and in housing and so forth. So a few frontrunners states then started after some racist incidents in mostly 70s, 80s, and sometimes 90s. And then with the European directives, member states were then obliged to introduce legislation that forbids discrimination in several, but far not all sectors. So now we are in a period in which we have a policy on paper, but it has already been said that there's serious issues on implementation, but also this legislation is really based on an individual rights model of enforcement, which makes that you are a victim and you go to court, and it cannot tackle structural and institutional discrimination that is operated by the institutions themselves or very deeply ingrained in our societies because of the hierarchies we instituted, in fact, since Enlightenment, slavery, and colonialism. And there we see a trend now, already before Black Lives Matter, but I mean, after Black Lives Matter and with the Anti-Racist Action Plan, it's in fact the first European policy document in which we go to the causes, where we are not only talking about that short period in history of Nazism that is typical for racism in Europe, but recognizes the roots of colonialism and slavery and the hierarchy that instituted. And that's because increasingly the racialized minorities are voicing and are giving their views and their mostly relevant insights on discrimination, while the individual rights model of enforcement was kind of still mainly developed by, I mean, there was anti-racism that an anti-discrimination movement that led to the directives was mainly led by white movements, in which then the dominant view of racism was kind of bad, deviant individuals that do bad things. They're not rational. They're radical right-wing extremists. And then if you punish, and you have to punish people, they have to go to court. While if we do not go beyond this individual rights model of enforcement and tackle the structural and institutional, the embedded racism, we will not move further with regards to racial equality and equity, I think.
Thanks a lot. And finally, let's go to Juliana. So, Juliana, would you say that racism and discrimination in Europe is increasing or decreasing over time?
Yes, hello, good morning, everyone. I think, Dave, that is the €1 billion question. Everybody asks, this is a common concern. I think to respond to that, we have to go back to the evidence. So to take a look what the data said. And to respond to your question, I think I would like to come back to two main points. One of them being the manifestation of racism, how it does manifest. And the second point being the collection of data. So coming back to the first point, it's important to understand that racism manifests itself differently, in different forms, impacts differently specific communities, especially at the individual level. So when you talk about increase or decrease of the, let's say, the trends on racism, what we can say is that we have a bank of data that will try to understand how one individual discriminates the other. So we are talking about here about the individual approach of racism discrimination. And of course, with the data, especially collected from civil society organizations, we can see there is an increase, unfortunately, affecting disproportionately racialized minorities. So, of course, here you can take a look on the example, for example, anti-Gypsyism and the Roma communities in Bulgaria, how this is being affected them individually. There is also the case of anti-Semitism, for example, in the rise in the Netherlands. You have the case of Afrophobia, discrimination against Black people, for example, in the South, in Portugal, in Spain. It's always on the rise. Islamophobia in France, it's a non-stop issue. It's a recurrent point of concern. However, where we do not have data and we do not have enough information is about structural and institutional discrimination. And here I come back to my second point, which is about equality data collection. Although the Commission has done immense effort to produce guidelines, actions, being more transversal about this demand in different EU agendas, member states still do not collect data segregated by race, ethnicity, and other categories. So it makes our work very difficult to understand, first of all, which are the increasing cases of individual discrimination, and then, of course, how are the ramifications also at the structural and institutional level. What is let's say, a positive and a point of hope is also the EU action plan that has been already mentioned here before by the other panelists, because the EU action plan will be a tool where we can increasingly demand the need for equality data collection. I think this is being very much streamlined across EU policy. So it's really important that we come back to this data to better understand the different specific forms of discrimination, but also how structurally institutional racism discrimination is impacting different minorities across Europe.
Thanks a lot. So I want to ask you guys about the issue of subsidiarity. So this is kind of a buzzword in Brussels that, to explain to a layperson, it's basically what competences should be at EU level and what competences should be at national level. And so when I think this issue of discrimination and racism, this is one of those issues that's very sensitive on this topic about who should be in charge of this, the EU or national governments. So Szabolcs, let me ask you, and from the Commission's perspective, where does this issue of anti-discrimination law best fit? What parts of it should be dealt with at EU level? What parts of it should be dealt with at national level? And that should question, does that match what is there in reality in the treaties? And would it be helpful to switch up the expectations or the law about this, about where anti-discrimination is tackled?
Thank you, Dave. That's a very important question. And indeed, the treaty is crystal clear. The EU has the competence to combat discrimination on exactly 6 grounds: sex, sexual orientation, ethnicity/race, religion/belief, age, disability. It does not need to be mixed with the substance matter of the area where we want to combat discrimination. So just give you the example. When we take education, we do have the right and the duty to combat discrimination in the access to education. But it is not up to the European Union to interfere into the way how the education is organized in the various member states. So the education system itself can be different, but the access to it must be equal. I think there we have a clear delineation where the subsidiarity starts and when the Commission can not interfere, can act. Sorry for using the wrong word. English is not my mother tongue. I think this is a very good division. The main problem is not here. The main problem we have is, and this was also mentioned previously, the unanimity. It is one of the few areas where we need unanimity for every legal act that we are proposing. And that is also the reason why one of the acts is already blocked by Council, as we heard it, for more than 12 years, 13 years by now. And this is for me the main issue. I think our ambition should be to change this unanimity requirement, which is possible by the treaty. There is a passerelle clause, but of course for that we need also common agreement by all member states. But as long as we have the unanimity, it is extremely difficult to advance with the legislative framework. And as long as that is the case, we have to look very much into the actual implementation, and there member states can do a lot. I don't want to prolong too much, but I think the discussion on equality data is extremely important. As it was just said, I mean, we are here in a situation that we are not getting regularly data from the statistical sources, even though that would be possible. And we are now in a process to get that started, but that is very much in the hands of the member states. But I must say that on that we are also working with Eurostat to get it moved. So this is the situation on the subsidiarity question.
Ilke, let me put this question to you, because Szabolcs mentioned there that access to education is an EU competence, but the education content itself is a national competence. And we know that so much of racism is learned behavior. It's something that we learn from our societies and we learn in school. We can learn that racism is bad in school, right? So is it difficult then, given that the EU can't really touch educational curricula, is it difficult then to have a pan-EU strategy on making sure that racism isn't learned in childhood?
I mean, it's not indeed because there's no legislative competence that nothing can be done. A lot of exchange of best practices and learning can be done. And I do not know how at the moment this is happening. But in the anti-racism action plan, if I remember well, there is attention to education, and education is indeed key. And I think in many schools, good practices are happening. I mean, it's schools are essential indeed, because we see so much unequal opportunities in schools. We know, for example, from research in Belgium, that racialized children are, but also this happens on the basis of class and even more at the intersection, are far more easily directed towards vocational technical training and not the general education system that prepares for the university and higher education. We know that from evidence in the UK that children that are expelled out of school, that there's also a race and ethnicity factor in that. We know that school handbooks still reproduce racist stereotypes. So I mean, I could see it in the handbooks of my children now in 2020 still. So there's so much to be done, but there's also a lot going on in civil society, also about teaching colonialism in school, which in many countries is not really taught. And if you don't do that, then it's very difficult to understand where we are today. So there's a lot of, I think, exchange and best practices possible. And I guess I'm sure INAR has a lot of recommendations there, but a lot can be done without necessarily also having legislation, and in that field it will be difficult to change that for the moment, but
yeah, for sure. Alice, let me get your take on this. I mean, where is the appropriate balance here about who sets anti-discrimination policy at EU level or at national level?
Thank you, Dave. I think that both Szabolcs and Ilke have explained it very well. I mean, we have the frameworks that we have, but that doesn't mean that we can't do anything, and that it is important that within the frameworks and the legislative frameworks that we have, it is so important that we really make sure that within the member states the work is being done. And all the things that Ilke so well put forward on how we can fight racism and fight the consequence of racism that discrimination also is, we had with us when I was the rapporteur for the Rights and Values Program, where we also argued in the negotiations for the amount of financing this program is so important to be able to make sure that civil society, universities, media, and so on and so forth really have financing to make sure that they can be part of this job that is needed to be done. But then I also think that it's so important that we who want to and that are willing to fight racism and fight discrimination are aware of that we have our treaties, and that the non-discrimination wordings within the treaties are important. They are not there just for fun. It's not just nice words. The people who created and processed our frameworks, our treaties, they did this for a reason. So I always start, when I have these kind of discussions and debates and take parts of this kind of seminars, I always refer back to what is said in our statutes. What shall the EU be? Thank you.
Juliana, when it comes to this question of whether the EU has the appropriate role here, what do you think? What is the right role for the EU? And is there some kind of leeway, some kind of framework here for the EU to get involved in educational content around anti-discrimination law, or is that too much treading on national sovereignty?
I think the EU has a pivotal role in better understanding the inconsistencies, the violations, and the gaps in many policies, legislation frameworks. I think as well the EU can be a moving force behind any kind of good practice and exchange and cooperation. In the frame of education, I think it's really important, like Ilke and Alice said, to go beyond just the legal framework and the legal approach. We can have a more constructive and more effective perspective, because sometimes the law does not move very fast as society is moving. Sometimes we need immediate and rapid response to societal demands and changes. In that said, I think the EU here can serve as well as a platform to be sure that member states are accountable of their actions and remain, let's say, role models in the fight of discrimination and racism. It's also important to understand that we cannot talk about any kind of educational tool. As Ilke said before, we have to have a decolonial approach to education. So we also have to come back to the question, what is the concept we are promoting? What is the framework that suits best this decolonial approach? Because otherwise we're gonna just reproduce the same historical inequalities and the historical narratives that are there, marginalizing racialized minorities and other minority groups.
Pierre, a question for you. We've had both Alice and Juliana have mentioned the geographic differences on this issue. We know there are significant geographic divides between Europe's West, East, and South, particularly on the issues of racial discrimination and LGBT discrimination. We also know that these differences are accompanied by wealth differences between countries, right? So how can Western Europe, which has different ideas about this than Eastern and to an extent Southern Europe, how can people from Western Europe talk to people from those other areas of Europe about these issues without coming off as lecturing or without coming off with a kind of sense of superiority?
Well, the first thing is that, as it has been mentioned, anti-discrimination policies should be a national policies. And what I've seen in Poland, in particular, from the LGBTIQ activists, is that who are they calling when they are confronted to a government that propose a discriminatory law. They go to the EU. So let's do not forget that EU is also hope. Is also hope. In fact, when you look precisely at what's happening in Hungary and in Poland, we can, and specifically in the polls, it is really threatening to scary to not scary, not threatening. This is really scary to see that with all the speeches anti-LGBT from the governments, the Western country believe that Hungarian and Polish people are homophobic. But when you look precisely at the polls, this is not the case. And this is absolutely not the case. So this is really something important, because when I go in Poland and say you have to be nicer with LGBTIQ people, I'm not the guy coming from the West lecturing the East. This is something that this society, the Polish society and the Hungarian society, is also defending. So maybe not defending, but also accepting. So this is a big victory of Orban and Kaczynski to have made Western Europeans believe that Hungarian and Polish people were homophobic.
Szebolt, the Commission is in kind of an awkward position here, right? Because the Commission executes the desires and the agreements of the national member states. It's the guarantor of the treaties. But you have different attitudes about this between national governments, as has been mentioned here several times. So when it comes to this geographic balance, how can the Commission make sure it isn't just focused on the attitudes or the norms of Western European states and maybe things that are not so familiar, or concepts that are not so familiar in Eastern Europe, for instance?
Thank you, Dave. If you allow me just a small but important correction. The Commission is certainly not executing the desire of member states. We are the guardian of the treaty, and what we are executing is the law which has been adopted by the legislator, which is the co-legislator, the European Parliament and the member states. And that is our duty, to make sure that these laws are applied throughout the European Union. I think this is extremely important. Of course, member states are very important partners, because when it comes to the implementation, it's in the member states that it is done. Now, I would also like to follow what Pierre just said. We have to be careful with trying to draw such a crystal clear picture of a divide between big and small, rich and less well-off, north, south, east, west. In the area of LGBTI, I can imagine that indeed, currently the impression might arise that there is such a clear divide, but as Pierre said, the reflections from the citizens, from the population, are not necessarily supporting this picture. And I can just also tell you that it's more in the substance matter itself. For instance, when you look into the details of discrimination, you see that it's clearly the group of trans persons who are all over Europe in a far worse situation than other people belonging to the group of LGBTIQ. So this is more the challenge we see, and not so much to see here the divide as you presented it from one part of the union to the other. We are very much putting our efforts on dialogue. We have, for instance, in the area of LGBTIQ, established a subgroup where all the member states are participating, where we are discussing the issues that are at stake with all the member states. And this is the way forward And one of the important elements in this discussion is also how to bring in the dialogue with the civil society. And if you allow me also to give you another example, and I like this example because it is the area where we have most of the experience, and that is the Roma inclusion. There we have set up structures together with member states that are in place where we meet regularly with the authorities of the member states, where we can discuss, exchange best practice, show each other how we are engaging in the dialogue, how we are tackling particular problems. And it functions well. It is not good enough because the results are not good enough, but this is the way that we are promoting in the European Commission, indeed, to keep the dialogue on equal footing. And again, the work on the Roma has shown and has made it understood that this is not a question which concerns only a handful of countries, but in the opposite, the discrimination of Roma is something which concerns each and every EU member state. And that is new. That was not that clear 10 years ago, that we have also discrimination issues in parts of the European Union where this is not so visible and obvious.
Juliana, on that point, I wanted to ask you, in the beginning of the panel, we saw that map of which EU countries have anti-discrimination strategies. They were mostly focused in the West, but there were a number of Eastern European countries that had them. But I'm wondering if those are specifically targeting anti-discrimination against Roma people. Is that the case, do you know? In Romania, for instance, I saw had a law.
Yes, what you had, I think Shabol's explained it very well. So what you had are different frameworks, and you had a Roma strategy that was there to put in place policies that would tackle the question of Roma inclusion, exclusion structurally. So of course, there are some national action plans trying to move forward a better inclusion of Roma communities in different sectors such as housing, education, employment. But the question is here, I come back to the first comment from the Commission, but also what Alice said and Pierre said about implementation. You can have the best legal framework and the legal proposals at the EU level. If you do not meaningful implementation at national level, these remain empty treaties, empty policies. So what happened with the Roma strategy was really a problem with the implementation. We do not know how the money was even correctly used for Roma communities. We do not know how these really impact structurally societal change. There is a very little information about the impact having the community as direct beneficiaries of these plans. So those, I know that we work a lot with, for example, with Ergo Network, and they have draft very interesting reports and publications, and you can see that there is a really lack of information on how we could really conclude that these frameworks were efficient in different member states.
Jose Antonio, do you think that there is a geographic divide between the people of Europe, or is it just a question of the governments?
Thank you, Dave. I think it's a question, I coincide with the previous speakers, I coincide it's a question of the different governments and different politics. But let me introduce some different points that I have. I like a lot your introductory video. And in your video, you say it is supposed that European Union citizenship is aware of discrimination. This is the key point. We do need to translate this debate into the real people that is in our streets, in our villages, in our cities. We do need three main axes to develop. First of all, awareness, to raise awareness among the citizenship, the European citizenship. Secondly, to develop pedagogy strategies, to let them know what discrimination is, at which tools they have to combat discrimination. And thirdly, education has been mentioned before. The historical roots of racism should be subject to renewed interest and action, especially in the area of the education, New curricula and new textbooks should be developed, and training programs for teachers and educators should be organized with the European Union support. An interdisciplinary approach to common European history and heritage, and also European Union responsibility, should be promoted at the secondary and tertiary levels of education. And just mention two different points that I want to underline. First of all, the European Pillar of Social Rights. As you know, the Commission presented the action plan on the European Pillar of Social Rights, and the European Economic and Social Committee hopes it will strongly support equality in the labour market. I want to mention the labour market also, including for people with a minority racial or ethnic background. We also hope that the social commitments of the European institutions and member states will be upheld in the difficult economic times created by the COVID-19 epidemic. And my last point is how to integrate. The ECC encouraged the Commission to better integrate various plans which have significant overlapping of objectives and instruments. We suggest integrating the Anti-Racism Action Plan, the strategy to implement the Charter of Fundamental Rights, the Democracy Action Plan, and the Rule of Law Report. Acknowledging the fact that these plans represent distinct policy fields, we should also identify common elements and synergies.
So we've talked a bit about education and how that can shape attitudes, particularly early in life. Let's also talk about the media and what role the media has to play here. Ilke, let me put this to you. What role should and does traditional print and broadcast media play in achieving progress and changing the way people think about these issues and the way they behave? And then also, what role is social media having in changing attitudes on this?
Okay, these are big questions. I mean, social media also reflect, the whole structures of our societies. They do things, but they're also a reflection of we can say the racialized social structure in which we live, in which, your life chances in health, education, housing, and everything is determined by ethnicity and race. So these, first, the media definitely reproduce racist stereotypes. There's abundant research about that, for example, if you have articles about Muslims in certain countries, the connotation, the majority of the articles is negatively connotated. So there a lot can be done. And I think, media should work with racialized civil society there to really, to be more aware. Sometimes it's also deliberate because it sells better. We also function in a system in which some things sell better than others. But I start from the idea that there's a willingness to change, and so this would be done. But it can also change if you have far more diversity of ethno-racial minorities in the media. And I think the BBC has always been given an example, and they have really had a positive action policy, and not everything is perfect at the BBC anyway. They're now out of the EU, so it's not an EU example anymore. But positive action to bring more a representation of the population in the media, and not only. This should definitely be done by public broadcasting companies. That's the state should give the example, but we know that in many countries private media are more followed. So there could also be legislation on that. So that's a bit of a problem also with the European policy. We have this individual rights model of enforcement where there's no positive obligation for positive action in member states, and in media this could be done. But now it's all voluntary. So that's one. And then social media are indeed also a reflection of what is happening in society. So if racism happens in daily life, it also happens in social media, sometimes even stronger. And there, I think that social media companies could be obliged to stronger act against hate speech. That's definitely the case. And also, I mean, sexist violence and hate speech. Let me start also by noticing or talking about a more positive development of social media. There's a lot we know of racist violence on there that should be tackled, but it has also allowed minority voices to speak up, to make voices that were otherwise not visible and heard to become heard. So that's kind of the positive story of social media, which should then be taken up by the mainstream media. But I think many other of the panelists can talk further about media and social media. But more diversity is definitely needed, and racist stereotypes are reproduced by the media, and that should definitely be tackled.
Yeah, it's an interesting point how so much of our anti-discrimination policy is kind of built around stopping negative examples, and it's less focused on positive examples, so making sure that there's positive representations and this type of thing. Juliana, what do you think? What is the role of the media here, both traditional media and social media?
Yes, Dave. I'd like to second what Ilka just said brilliantly. I think there are two sides of this medal. Of course, there is a very negative side, and I agree with everything that she said, especially in terms of media, mainstream media being a platform for criminalization of minorities, also being a platform to reinforce stereotypes, negative and toxic narrative towards specific groups, especially migrants, Muslim, especially also in the intersection of gender. If you take a look about how media treats Muslim women, migrant women, Black women. So I think there is also a component of gender here that needs to be highlighted. However, I also like to take a look at the good side of things, and having learned from Black Lives Matter movement and what happened with George Floyd, for example, it was thanks to social media that this issue came across the highlights, the headlines. Do not forget that racism and racial discrimination is not a hot topic. Not many mainstream media, television, broadcast, newspapers are interested to cover the realities of ethnic minorities and racial minorities. They, especially in Europe, they think that this is not a European problem. This isn't a problem from outside Europe, but not a problem within Europe. And I think what happens with social media is that we bring these subjects back to the table. Social media has become a platform to increase and give more visibility to the specific needs and the specific violence and abuses that racialized minorities suffer at local level. I think it's also important to highlight that many of the movements of mobilization was only possible due to social media. If you take a look at the climate justice movement and racial justice movement, this is also was a really, really strong platform for engagement and mobilization.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think we've seen a lot of European media historically and still currently portray these types of issues as kind of non-European issues, particularly as American issues, and there's been less examination of the issues here in Europe. But we've seen on social media, particularly during the Black Lives Matter movement, people actually saying, hey, we have these issues here in Europe, let's talk about them. Alice, let's go to you next. What do you think is the role of media here, both traditional and social?
Yes, I'm sitting here jumping because there are so many things that you want to say, and all of the others are saying so many smart things, and you want to add. And so I really have to concentrate to answer your question, because I would like to talk about this for hours and hours. But first of all, I really want to underline something that I've said before, but that I have felt and know is so important. And that is that we really speak in Swedish. I'm from Sweden. We say that you speak out of your beer, that you speak the truth. And it's about, again, the willingness. We were talking some minutes ago about where is the line, is it in the west or the east of Europe, which member states? But as I think Jose said, it's really about different politicians in different governments, forming different governments, and what kind of politics that they are putting forward. Because again, it is a fact that there are a lot of politicians, there are several governments that doesn't care, because they are not affected from the racism and the discrimination. I mean, when I was a minister for democracy and culture in the Swedish government, when I went to Spain during World Pride, and we were supposed to parade, on the Saturday of Pride, you go in this big parade, and there were 1 million participants in the parade, in the march. I was the only minister, and even though I have had meetings with several ministers from the Spanish government, they didn't, and they had said to me that they should come to the march. They didn't show up. And when I was a minister, I went to meetings about the discrimination against Roma within the EU. I was always the only minister. And even though I tried to call other responsible ministers in other governments and telling them, please come to this meeting because we need to fight the racism and the discrimination against Roma, they didn't show up because it wasn't important enough. And if we are not really saying this and putting this as a fact on the table, then I also meet people, white people especially within the EU, who says, is discrimination such a big problem, really? Because they are not affected and they don't know that there are governments not willing to take this fight. But I think that media has a great importance. And just as I think it was Julia that said it, that social media has really been a good tool when it comes to us who are racialized and are victims of discrimination to put our story out in the reality, because the traditional media often doesn't put this, too often are not the best example. I think that BBC, for example, is a great example. They have done a lot. They are not part of the EU, Great Britain anymore, but the media could definitely do so much more. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that experience of hearing Europeans say, oh, I don't think there is discrimination in Europe, I think that's something a lot of people watching can relate to. I think that's something we hear a lot on this continent, unfortunately. Szabolcs, let's go to you next. What do you think is the appropriate role for the media here, both traditional and social?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks Alice also for having been all the time active and present when it came also to the Roma inclusion. And so you said already a lot of things that I was also about to share. I think media is extremely important to get the politicians mobilized. At the end, the politicians, they watch very carefully what the media is writing, and if a subject is taken up, which is perhaps not necessarily in the same way for the whole of the European Union important, but for the given country, for the given region, it really matters. Then it is important that the media is active, that they make their independent research, that they present the facts as they are, so that people also have the chance to well understand that we do have an issue at stake. And just let me take this example of colonialism. At the end, it is true, these heavy crimes committed under the colonial rule, they are directly only to be associated to a handful of EU member states. But it would be too easy to say that for all the other EU member states who never had any colonies and who perhaps even up until recently were in a state of semi-colonial status, have nothing to do on the racism front. There are other issues. There we might have segregation, sterilization, Nazi crimes, slavery. The list is endless. And there the media is extremely important to bring the topics on the table and to tell also the politicians that this is where we need to have actions. By the way, We spoke first about the regional differences. I think we are all fully aware that the fact that, for instance, people with disability, age, and sexual orientation are not yet legally protected beyond employment is due to the action of one of the founding EU member states. Yeah? So this is this has to be seen that, and perhaps if the media would have been more active at that time, perhaps this could have been avoided. Now, coming to the social media, this is actually an area of big concern for us here in the European Commission, dealing with all these questions. We have noted during the COVID all these stereotypes, negative biases, conspiracies, which have been spreaded through the social media, targeting on certain minority groups, and we are really seeing the huge danger to our societies stemming from this uncontrolled way how not even information, but some statements are spread through social media. And at the end, we know that these biases, they can then lead to action like bullying and so on. At the next stage, it can lead to discrimination, which is illegal. And then it can even continue to hate crime. And in the worst case, we saw genocides, which are all somewhere based on the biases. And that's why we are really concerned about the way how these social media are operated. And I'm really very happy that we have now the discussion on the Digital Services Act, where you know that one of the objectives is exactly to protect also the consumers and the fundamental rights of the consumers, and through that the society as a whole from manipulation and misinformation. And I'm really happy that the European Union, as the first economic entity, has started to tackle this very grave problem for our societies. Thank you.
Jose Antonio, you wanted to come in on this question of the media as well?
Yes, thank you, Dave. I think the role of the media is crucial, and they are extremely important because they are creating public opinion. So we have problems across European Union with the media. We have problems with the independence of the media in some countries. We have problems with the lack of independence of media and the concentration of the media. We have problems with the lack of pluralism in some countries, and with the oligarchs, owners of media in some other countries. So we have to be conscious of this. We have to be aware that the independence of the media is at stake. And the European Union has to develop strategies to protect real independent media, because they have an extremely important role to develop strategies to raise awareness against discrimination and to avoid fake news against minorities. We have seen that even journalists has been killed in Malta, in the Netherlands, in the Czech Republic. So it is important to open the debate about the independence of the media, the real independence of the media, and to protect them for the menaces, even not only from the oligarchs and the lobbies, but also from governments nowadays in the European Union.
Let's go to some questions from the audience. Pierre, I'll put this first question to you since you mentioned it in your first comment. This question is from Trajan. Could the EU COVID-19 travel certificate promote discrimination? How to prevent this? So I think this is going at the issue we've seen in many countries, including here in Belgium, that racial minorities have a lower rate of vaccination. And so could that actually lead to discrimination when you are requiring vaccination for various activities and for travel? Paul Lim has a related question here. He says, on COVID, one cannot say that discrimination was intended. Could it be? COVID obviously affects the rights and freedoms, but are COVID measures illegitimate to protect the general population? So again, I think going to this point that there could be knock-on effects, so that the intent isn't racial discrimination, but the effect could be there. What do you think, Pierre?
Well, I give an example. This question of the place where you are confined. This is a clear answer to the issue I raised about question in some families. We had another example during COVID-19 crisis. There were this Belgium-Romanian couple, two guys. They were married in Belgium, but their marriage was not recognized in Romania. The fact that it was forbidden to come in Romania if you are not member of a family, this led just to the separation of this couple. And that was something that was not by purpose. I mean, this was not intended, but this was a consequence. But we have possible solutions, and we must take into account this kind of cases. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why the European Commission is working on the mutual recognition of all the family in Europe to avoid this kind of. So you can see that there were concrete discriminations because this was two men, but it is possible to find solution if you take time and if you try to find a way of dealing with that.
Alice, put this question to you as well. Do you think there could be some unintended knock-on effects of these types of COVID policies, like the digital passports? Also speaking maybe to a digital divide, a digital discrimination, as we move forward with these technologies and these COVID rules. Can there be unintended consequences there?
The short answer is yes, if you want to move on. Of course it can, and it has already been shown. I mean, the digital devices, even though many of us, I'm sure, have iPhones and those kind of techniques, of course, all people don't have that support. I talked to a representative for one of our Roma communities the other week, and she told me that in her village, many of them, a minority had iPhones, have these digital devices, and it's not only affected them now when COVID pass are being more and more common to get into restaurants and so on and so forth, but also when it comes to homeschooling and having digital platforms for children, those children who goes to school, to be able to follow the school. So it have had a massive negative effect on the Roma community she came from. So yes, all the things that we are now enforcing and trying to do to help us, to protect us, and to still get our societies going can also have a negative and a discriminational effect on some people. Yes.
We have another COVID-related question here from Emanuela. Juliana, I'll put this question to you. So Emanuela asks, what is the impact of COVID in employment inclusion of ethnic diversity? What can the European Union do to ensure that the current gap in job access between EU and non-EU individuals will decrease in the future? So Juliana, we're seeing a whole lot of upheaval in the labor market right now. The Great Resignation, it's called. There's a lot of labor movement because of COVID and because of, as we're coming out of the pandemic, hopefully. Are there racial discrimination issues coming into play there because of that specific COVID situation?
Yes, Dave, of course, as previously mentioned, COVID just exacerbated the previous inequalities that were there. So if you take a look at the employment, the labor market as a sector, if before the COVID, racialized minorities were already highly impacted by discrimination, not only in recruitment, but throughout their careers, the mobility, glass ceiling, you're going to see this being exacerbated during the pandemic. But coming back to the question, I think one of the main challenges remain that racialized minorities were those more exposed to go back to on-site work. So racialized minorities in general did not have the benefit of working from home. So it means that they were there to provide essential a service to the population, and this being healthcare, this being in transport, this being in the food sector, this being in many essential sectors of the society. And with that, of course, first of all, they were exposed to the virus, but also the sectors that were using racialized minorities as handforce, such as small, medium companies, independent service, having these people that were forced to fire some workers because they didn't have the resources to continue to pay salaries during the pandemic. So racialized minorities here, they are also impacted by that. Plus, a very interesting angle in terms of employment is that they were also the most controlled by police during the pandemic. They were those who were more monitored in terms of mobility, who can walk, who can work, why you were not at home. So what we can see as well that many of racialized employers, they were at least many times stopped and searched by the police in these mobility controls. And at the end, there were also the minorities that got the highest fine by, let's say, infringing the confinement rules.
Szabolcs, you wanted to come in on this employment issue?
Yes, briefly. Thank you very much. Employment and Roma. I would just like to recall that today we have roughly 80% of the Roma living in poverty, compared to 17% of the general population, which means that, for instance, 30% of the households in average of the EU do not even have access to tap water. So you can imagine how under such circumstances, indeed, distance education can function. The response is crystal clear. It's no. But I see it is not only a problem of the COVID situation as such, but I see it rather as a challenge that we have to tackle for the future, because already now the situation is such that the share of those young Roma who are neither in employment nor in education anymore is far higher, and that was even growing before COVID, than the general population. And there's a huge risk if the politics is not taking countermeasures to catch up this education gap, that we will end up even in a more difficult situation. Now we have the information on Roma because of all the statistical surveys, but you can extrapolate that this is true for many of the ethnic minority communities with migrant background, which are in a precarious situation. So it's not only a current problem, and this has nothing to do with the COVID certificate or so. It is really the as it was rightly said, COVID has just shown us the problems which were often covered, but which were there in the European society. Now they came at the surface, and it's crystal clear we have to do something against it if we want to avoid problems on the long run. And I fully agree on the representation of educated persons from the minority groups, also within the institutions, by the way, including also the European institutions, including the European Commission, without question.
Alice, you wanted to come in on this employment and COVID issue also?
Yes, and again, I would like to have this discussion with all of you all the time. Szabolcs, you need to invite me for coffee, because we need to discuss this and do things even further. But I just wanted to add that Sweden, my home country, is one of the richest countries, not only in the EU, but in the world. And Sweden is also one of the countries that have managed the best during COVID so far, when it comes to national economics. Even though this is a fact, it's have now been revealed that the black market, as we call the illegal working market, especially when it comes to constructing, have been an area where the problems have grown. And a lot of people from the eastern part of Europe, from member states, but also outside the EU, from a different part of the old Soviet Union, have now working conditions in Sweden on big construction. We are building more than ever houses and big projects where their payments have been dumped, and they have no security, no nothing. And this says something about the greed, but also about discrimination and racism, where Sweden is developing and moving forward, but there are people that are discriminated that pays the price during COVID-19. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting point in kind of the underside of economic development. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there because we're just about out of time, but some really, really interesting points here. I think the two things that really came up is, A, that COVID didn't cause racial discrimination. COVID exacerbated racial discrimination, right? And we could see it playing out over the past year and a half. But the other thing that we saw play out over the past year and a half, which came up several times during this panel, is the Black Lives Matter movement, and how there was certainly here in Europe a kind of awakening to a lot of these issues that I think for a lot of Europeans, they didn't fully understand before, didn't fully understand existed here. I think particularly, as we mentioned, in European media, there's been a lot of focus on racial discrimination in other countries outside of Europe, and there's been less of a willingness to examine the racial discrimination that takes place here. So I think really, really great discussion, and obviously an ongoing one. I encourage you guys to get that coffee and continue that conversation, because there is so much to do here, both at EU level and at national level. We talked a little bit about the appropriate split there. And certainly as we come out of the COVID pandemic and the economy goes through this kind of weird, wobbly period, particularly with the employment market, we will eventually get back to at least a new normal. And part of that new normal can be a more honest, open conversation about racial discrimination in Europe, and really trying to make things better for everyone, for all of us to live together in a society. So thank you guys so much for speaking with us this morning. Thank you at home for following along and asking some great questions. And we'll see you here next time for the next EA debate. Take care.